Welcome everyone to part 4 of our unit 8, which is looking at clinical psychology. So today what we're going to be doing is wrapping up our look at disorders, and we kind of have this broad category that we're going to call other disorders, where we're going to look at a few different groups that we have left here. So the first group that we're going to look at, let's see, where can I get out of the way here, are somatic, symptom, and related disorders. So we have kind of somatic symptom disorder, and then we have these other two that we'll talk about that are kind of related to it. So somatic symptom disorder is a psychological disorder where the symptoms take a somatic, which means bodily form, without apparent physical cause. So what this basically means, and this is going to kind of be loosely connected to all the other ones that we talk about. What this basically means is there is some sort of psychological problem going on. So a really simple example we could use is like something like stress. Right, so we've got a lot of stress, and for whatever reason, that stress isn't just taking kind of like the regular emotional, psychological toll that stress would normally take on us, but it's also representing itself in physical changes, right? Physical problems that shouldn't be related to it. So let's kind of look at, I think, maybe the first example of conversion disorder, and I think maybe this will give us kind of a nice example. I think these disorders are probably the most complicated to think about because they just feel really weird to kind of talk about them. So let's look at conversion disorder a little bit to kind of pull this apart. So conversion disorder is a disorder in which a person experiences very specific physical symptoms that are not compatible with recognized medical or neurological conditions. Okay, so an example of conversion disorder might be where something happens. Let's say you fall. Let's say you fall off your bike, or you fall down a step or whatever, and you land on your right arm. Okay, now normal symptoms, right? You fell on your right arm. Maybe you get a bruise. Maybe you feel pain. Maybe you feel sore. Right? If you broke a bone, obviously, maybe it's going to feel even more sore. That would be like normal, what we would normally expect. With someone that's experiencing conversion disorder, what might happen is they might fall on their arm, and their whole arm will go numb, right? And so they go to the doctor because something's wrong, and their doctor looks at it and they find that their arm's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but the symptom of that numbness is actually real. And we can see this where sometimes there's pain. We can see this where sometimes people will have full on like paralysis of a limb. So they'll fall, maybe they'll fall on their arm and their limb will become paralyzed, but when they look at like the actual neurons and the actual nerves and look at all the muscles and the bones in the arm, everything's fine. So your arm should be fine, right? Biologically and physically it's fine, but for whatever reason you're experiencing this disorder, right? You're experiencing this physical symptom, even though there's not an actual cause for it physically. That's what conversion disorder is. So you can think about how this is kind of connected to somatic symptom disorder, right? Where there's some sort of psychological thing going on that's causing real physical symptoms, okay? Again, you can kind of think of disversion disorder, you can kind of make it more extreme if that's helpful, where maybe I fall on my right arm and for whatever reason, my left foot is completely numb. Can't move it, can't feel it, right? And I can go to the doctor and they can, poke it. I won't feel anything. I won't notice anything, right? Even though there's no reason why my foot should be having those symptoms when I fall on my arm, right? So you can think about how there's basically no way to explain those symptoms physically. So it must be some sort of psychological thing that's going on here. It's a very kind of weird and kind of tricky disorder to wrap our heads around a little bit. The last example here that goes in this kind of somatic symptom disorder group is the illness anxiety disorder. So this one's pretty straightforward though. We've probably all heard of it as either hypochondria or hypochondriasis. So what it really is called is illness anxiety disorder, at least now this is what it's called. Illness anxiety disorder is a disorder in which a person interprets normal physical sensations as symptoms of a disease. So, for example, you're laying around and you get hungry and your stomach kind of gurgles, right? You've all probably had that before. Someone who has illness anxiety disorder might feel that stomach grumble and think, "Oh my God, I have stomach cancer. I need to go to my doctor." Right? So they go to their doctor checks them out, and they're fine. Now, another thing that happens with illness anxiety disorder is, generally speaking, these people are unable to be convinced that everything's okay. So they start looking at a whole bunch of normal sensations that they should be feeling, whether it's like simple pain or being hot or cold or being tired or your stomach or your heart or whatever. They feel normal sensations. They go to the doctor checks them out, the doctor says, nope, everything looks good, you should be perfectly healthy. A lot of times what we'll see is that they're unable to be convinced, and so what they'll do is they'll go to a new doctor. This can obviously be really challenging because when someone is hopping from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor, they're not getting kind of consistent looks, right? So they're not necessarily, their original doctor isn't going to necessarily go, oh, this person has illness anxiety disorder, I should get them to a psychologist, right? Because they went to a different doctor. And that next doctor is not going to think it because they've only seen them one time, right? They'll go to a new doctor. They won't necessarily think it. So it can be really challenging to diagnose these people and get them to treatment, right? But they're still kind of, they believe they're incredibly anxious that they have something wrong. Our next group of disorders are dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders are kind of a controversial group, and they're very, very rare. So there's a few different types of dissociative disorders. We're really only going to talk about one, although there are kind of a few that are smaller. Again, all of these disorders are really, really rare, so we don't see a lot of them, and there's also a lot of controversy about what's really happening. And this we can kind of see in our next piece as well. We're going to look at our example, but there's kind of a big question as to, when we see these different symptoms, what is causing them, right? Where is it really coming from? Is it its own disorder, or should it be connected with a different disorder, or is it not a disorder at all, right? So this is kind of this one isn't quite fully settled yet psychologically. So when we're looking at dissociative disorders, the big things are we're going to see conscious awareness become separated, which is what dissociated means, from previous memories, thoughts, or feelings. Okay? So conscious awareness becomes separated from previous thoughts, memories, or feelings. So one example I can give you that, and it actually may have changed names now, but if I remember, it used to be called like a dissociative phobe. And what it was is basically people would be like, let's say they were walking home, and all of a sudden they would kind of like snap into consciousness, and they would be 100 miles away, and they would have taken a bus and gotten on a plane and, and not remembered any of it or known why, right? Or sometimes it's like days later, and they have no idea, they have no memory of what happened in between those kind of pieces. That's an example of dissociation, right? Where there's their conscious awareness between what's happening, what happened before, what they're doing right then is basically separated. It's lost. It's dissociated from what we would normally see. The biggest example of this is what's called dissociative identity disorder. So dissociative identity disorder is a disorder in which a person exhibits two or more distinct and alternating personalities. So this used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now, again, that name has been changed. I'm sure you've all heard of multiple personality disorder. Now, again, what we're seeing, or what we would be talking about, is this idea of dissociation. So when we have multiple personalities, right, we're seeing splits, right, between the thoughts, feelings, memories of these distinct personalities. Now, again, this is another one that is pretty controversial, right, or an example of why it's controversial. So what makes dissociative identity disorder controversial is that we don't really know if it's a true disorder that's dealing with anxiety, right? That some sort of anxiety is happening, or if it's created by therapists and clients. So there is kind of a theory, at least by some people, again, this is kind of where it's not really settled, that sometimes, right, it's possible for some clients to have maybe some other disorder, right? Maybe they have something like schizotypal personality disorder, and they're kind of like fantasy prone, right? And so through the process of either their life or through the process of therapy where they're going in and they're talking about it, they basically kind of create these actual identities. They create these different identities. So again, this is kind of where the question kind of comes in, right? Is there this anxiety that's happening and that's causing these actual splits in a person, or is this something that's kind of created through a different disorder, right? Something where like I have another disorder, but it's manifesting itself in this way through these different identities that I create as opposed to them just naturally being split. It's a little complicated. So that's going to get us into personality disorders. Personality disorders are kind of an interesting group here. So there's a whole bunch of different personality disorders. There's actually 10. We're not going to go over every single one of them in depth. We're really only going to talk about one in depth. But you can kind of go through and we'll actually play this video that talks about each one kind of briefly. But you can kind of go through and pick apart the different ones and kind of think about each one individually as you need. So what a personality disorder is an inflexible and enduring behavior pattern that impairs social functioning. So there's, again, kind of two big parts, right? It's enduring and inflexible pattern of behavior, and it impairs social functioning, okay? Enduring and inflexible and impairs social functioning. So this is the example I usually kind of suggest looking through these when you're doing the character psychological profile, because a lot of times when we see characters in like TV and movies and books and things like that, a lot of times we could probably connect them with one of these because we don't tend to write people and create characters that represent real life people, right? A lot of times they'll have specific behaviors or specific characteristics that are kind of like the majority of what their personality is, right? So we can see that a lot in that idea of being inflexible and enduring, and then also impairing their function. So there are 3 clusters when we talk about personality disorders: cluster A, B, and C. So cluster A is what is considered the eccentric or odd behaviors. Okay, so there's 3 groups. I think there's 3 in here. One of the big ones is what's called schizotypal personality disorder. This does not mean schizophrenia, but there are some kind of connections between fantasizing and it's not that they hallucinate, but they kind of are very, very imaginative, right? So it makes them kind of eccentric or odd. Cluster B is dramatic or impulsive behaviors. So we have borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder tends to be very dramatic, so they tend to shift from like hot to cold. They'll be like completely in love with someone, and then literally the next day they are absolutely crushed and traumatized from that person, and they'll kind of switch back and forth. Narcissistic personality disorder can also kind of be dramatic. It's just focused on themselves, obviously. Most people kind of have an idea what narcissism is or what it means to be a narcissist. And then we have cluster C. Cluster C is anxiety. So avoidant personality disorder is an example of cluster C, where they basically have anxiety about people, right? About other people or interacting with them. So they're going to avoid them, thus avoidant personality disorder, to simplify it a lot. So the one example that we are going to talk about a little bit is antisocial personality disorder. Now, antisocial personality disorder is a little tricky, especially if we're thinking about avoidant personality disorder. So when we say antisocial personality disorder, a lot of people think of someone who's just kind of like really, really introverted and just doesn't really like to interact with people. That's actually not what antisocial personality disorder is. People with antisocial personality disorder lack a consciousness. They basically lack that feeling of wrongdoing, even when we're talking about friends and family members. Now, when we're talking about any kind of disorder, but even when we're talking about something like antisocial personality disorder, this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody with antisocial personality disorder is some kind of like serial killer who's just out there doing horrible things all the time, right? They can be perfectly wonderful people. It just kind of takes learning, right? So basically that kind of consciousness, that internal consciousness of, doing something wrong is basically just kind of not there. Now, a lot of times, though, this does lead to them being more aggressive, ruthless, or even clever con artists, right? They tend to kind of show these different trends, right? As you can imagine, if you don't have a consciousness or a conscience, It's not a consciousness. If you don't have a conscience, it's a little more likely that you're willing to do things that maybe other people wouldn't do. We do see some pretty big patterns with this personality disorder, actually. So generally speaking, people with antisociality personality disorder, they tend to be male. We also see that symptoms tend to appear really early in age, so as early as 8 years old. And for most of them, by the time they're teenagers, it's incredibly clear that they have antisocial personality disorder. So again, you can kind of imagine where, when you're around like 8-year-old kids, you might kind of start to notice that one kid doesn't really seem to feel bad for anybody else. They don't seem to care when somebody else gets hurt or someone else, is upset. They may be like kind of more aggressive than we would expect other kids to be. If we take that same kid, by the time they're a teenager, it becomes very, very clear. It's easy to see that they do not feel empathy for other people. So it becomes really, really simple, or really kind of plain, generally speaking, to notice these people in society. Sometimes we label people with antisocial personality disorder as sociopaths or psychopaths. Sociopaths and psychopaths are not in the DSM at all. I believe they used to technically be how we categorized it, but now it's all summed up within antisocial personality disorder. Again, too, I think it's really important to mention, obviously, antisocial personality disorder is defined by this lack of conscience and this kind of lack of empathy, right, for other people. Again, it is really possible for people to still be wonderful, fine members of society. I remember watching this really interesting interview with a guy who had antisocial personality disorder, and he kind of talked about how he basically just kind of learned to think about it, right? So like when he does something that hurts somebody else, he still says he doesn't feel bad. Like it doesn't affect him that way, but he internally, like consciously, I don't know if that's probably not the right word, I guess, but knows that it hurt that other person, if that makes sense. Like he doesn't feel bad about it, but maybe he knows like socially it's not really acceptable. So and he's a perfectly fine person. He has a job and a family and all that kind of stuff. But he just doesn't have that kind of conscience that we would normally connect with people. So our last group of disorders are eating disorders. So these ones are pretty straightforward. For most of us, we have at least a pretty good idea about what eating disorders kind of are and what they look like. So our first example is going to be anorexia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder in which a person maintains a starvation diet despite being significantly underweight, sometimes accompanied by excessive exercise. So the big thing here is going to be kind of those extremes, right? Where it's not just like, hey, I'm on a diet because I want to lose a little bit of weight. It's, I am dieting to the point of starvation, because even though I'm already underweight. Again, this can look different ways. So sometimes we can see, people who are exercising crazy hard. Sometimes we'll see focus on diet. There's been some examples where people eat other things to help. So like something like, I think one example is like cotton balls. People eat cotton balls because then you feel full, even though obviously it's really horrible for you. So those would all kind of be under this anorexia nervosa disorder. Our next example is bulimia nervosa. So bulimia nervosa is connected but looks a little different. So bulimia nervosa is an eating disorder in which a person binge eats followed by inappropriate weight loss promoting behavior like vomiting, laxative, fasting, or excessive exercise. So it looks a little bit different than anorexia nervosa. Generally speaking, with anorexia, we're just going to see this starvation diet is like kind of the main thing we're going to see. With bulimia, we see binging and purging is basically the two aspects of it. So binge eating is where we are going to just eat a ton of food all at once. It doesn't have to be like, we don't necessarily have to do this every day, but there'll be times where we basically just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And then what's going to happen is after we do that, we're going to use some sort of behavior to purge that. So the most like common, or at least the one that we normally think of, is vomiting, right? We eat a whole bunch of behavior, eat a bunch of food, and then we go and we force ourselves to vomit it all up. Laxatives can kind of work the exact same way. Obviously, it's just not throwing it up. Fasting is another thing. So maybe we go through and we binge eat, and then we say, I'm not eating for 3 days, right? Again, this is binging, purging. The exact same thing we can see with excessive exercise. So instead of vomiting or using some other method, right, I go and I binge eat, and then I work out for like 4 or 5 hours straight, right, where I'm exercising, but to the point where it's unhealthy, right? So we can kind of see these two aspects, binging and purging. And then the last example of an eating disorder is binge eating disorder. So binge eating disorder is just the binging part of bulimia, basically. So significant binge eating episodes followed by distress, disgust, or guilt, but without the compensatory behavior that marks bulimia. So what that means is basically we're going to see the binge eating part of bulimia without the purging part. So we go through, we eat, we go through binge eating where we're eating massive amounts of food all at once, or at least a lot more than we normally would. And then what we're going to have is distress, disgust, or guilt. So you can think of kind of that psychological aspect that comes with it. So I go through and binge eat, and then I feel horrible about myself. Now, again, this isn't like I was really sad and I ate a thing of ice cream, and then after that I kind of felt bad about it for a little bit. These are, again, just like all disorders, are impacting people's lives. So I am binging huge amounts of food, and then I become incredibly distressed. I'm disgusted with myself. I feel incredible amounts of guilt to the point where it's affecting my life. It's affecting my ability to function day to day. It's not just, hey, I feel like I'm a little overweight. I shouldn't have eaten that much, right? These are going to be kind of a step above. Again, all of these are also pretty common, although not necessarily something that people go and seek treatment for, even though realistically they should. So we can kind of see how all these are connected. So that's going to wrap up our last few groups of disorders. So again, we had our somatic syndromes, right, and disorders, somatic disorders, and kind of the ones that are connected to it. We had our dissociative disorders, really just talked about one, but there is an umbrella there of a few more. We looked at our personality disorders, which again, we only really focused on one, but there's 10. So we'll get those other pieces in class when we kind of go over that basic video, and then our eating disorders at the end. Take a few moments, do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys next time.